to another pen-related video. My name is Doug, and I was asked to do a response to the video that I did before I left traveling, where I went through a number of decisions I'd made about what I was going to travel with in terms of fountain pens and paper and so forth. So, now that I'm back, how did things go? Well, so the first pen that I chose to take with me was my Moonman C1. Now, this pen, the reason I decided to take it was because it holds the largest amount of ink of any pen that I own. This is amazing. I think it was close to 5 milliliters of ink. I have since replenished it. I used a little bit of it, but this was inked up with diamine bilberry, which is one of my favorite dark purple inks. And this pen has a Fullywhen medium nib, because the Moonman that originally came with it I took out and used in another pen. But the Fullywhen medium served well. It certainly uses a lot of ink, and I used this now and then. I didn't tend to use it a lot because it was in my pen case, and you really can't travel with this. There's no clip. You don't want to put it in your pants pocket. So it wasn't as easily accessible. I only took it because of the large ink capacity, not knowing how much ink I was going to use. So I used it a little bit, but I wouldn't recommend traveling with it because, again, it has no clip and you just can't put it in your shirt. The next pen was my PenBBS 456. This ends up being probably the pen that I would recommend traveling with. Now, remember, I was traveling by car, but if you're traveling by plane, because this is a vacuum filler and you can seal off this compartment here, this would be the one that you'd want to take if you were changing elevations. But even traveling by car, I use this almost every day, probably every other day. And I was gone for a little bit more than a month, and I came back and this still had ink in it. Now, I've since replenished the ink supply, but I could have written for another couple of days with it and it still had ink. Plus the fact that it is a beautiful writer. This one has a Schmidt nib that came in my Moonman M600. I didn't like the Moonman that came in it, and I swapped it out for into another one of my pens. And this Schmidt nib I didn't really like in my M600 for some reason or another, but the more I used this nib, the better it got. I'm thinking of switching this out for a PenBBS medium that I'm receiving in the mail in the next couple of days. I bought one of those little PenBBS fobs that have a medium nib in it. So, but still, that Schmidt ended up being very nice, and I use this pen a lot. The next one is my favorite pen of them all. Still my favorite. I wrote with this absolutely every single day. This is my PenBBS 308 Amber is a Cat. I love the acrylic, and this nib, I can't say enough about this nib with the paw prints on it and the slightly upturned nib. This writes beautifully. This is my favorite pen of all of my pens, including my Visconti. And because I eyedroppered it, it takes a ton of ink. Again, as I say, I wrote with it every single day, and it came home with still ink left in it. I used it like this. I put it in with my little fake Midori, and so I had it in my car, and I would put this clip into there, and it ended up being in my pocket all the time, it was ended up in the center console of my Ford Escape, and it fit perfectly. So I was tracking down mileage, looking at the calendar, making events, and then writing little notes about what was happening during the day, during our travels. And then at night, I would transfer those notes to my web journal, and writing out in my journal every night. So this went everywhere with me, this pen. As an eyedropper, it probably wouldn't travel well in an aircraft, so I would recommend the 456 for that purpose, but this pen goes with me everywhere. Then I took another 308, and I took my 308 cedar because it is, I didn't eyedropper this one because this one doesn't have a silicone ring on it for some reason or another, but it has the converter. And so I thought, well, I better take a converter pen just in case the others run out of ink, because I had brought these little cartridges that I filled with my favorite inks. I didn't touch any of these because with this ink capacity between these 3 pens, I could write for 3 months, probably. So I didn't end up using the cedar that much, but when I did open it to say, okay, well, maybe I should write with this just to see how it goes, it had completely dried up. So from a full converter of diamine bilberry in there, it had completely dried. I pushed the converter down some to press the remaining ink into the feed, and it wrote a bit, but that's how much that nib evaporated into that cap. Something to think about. Then I took 2 M2s, one with a 0.7 stub and Yamabudo, and one with a 1.1 stub and Emerald of Chivor, Gerbon. These were kind of novelty pens for me. I thought, well, I want to practice writing with stubs because these are my first 2. I've discovered that the 0.7 is probably the one I would want to go with if I'm going to write with a stub on a regular basis. But again, these are not kind of traveling pens. They don't fit into pockets very nicely. You don't want to put them in your pants. They just don't travel very well, in my estimation. I didn't mention this in my original video, but the day before I left, I got my Natami Inception, but it came with a bent nib, a bent section. Bobby said he was going to send me a new one, but of course it was going to arrive after I left. So because he had committed to giving me a new section, I took the old section and put some vice grips on it and straightened it out as best I could. Here it is here. There's still a gap in here, but I wanted to try out that nib. So it wrote. It didn't write very well. I smoothed it a bit before I left, and then I wrote with it while I was away, and I wasn't impressed with it at all. So I was really hoping when I got back that the new nib feed and section would be a little bit improved from the first one, and I was pleasantly surprised that it is substantially better. This is now a terrific pen that my wife owns. In terms of papers, I just mentioned my fake Midori. It was very useful, and I'm using it every day now, even though I'm not traveling. But I made notes. I had calendar entries in here where we were going to be, and made notes every day about where we were, and then I would take those notes and transfer them to my Rhodia Webnote journal. Now I started this a couple of, maybe a week before I left, and I was gone, as I say, about 4.5 weeks, and this is now full. And so next week I need a new one. But this, with the Clairefontaine paper, I know it's a little bit more expensive, but my goodness, this is a beautiful, beautiful journal. And so I'm going to continue to use that. Before I left, I also found this in a bookstore. This is a nice little sleeve that you can put on any book to hold your eyeglasses or a number of pens. But I put it on, so I can work around the camera here. There we go. I put it on my web journal, Webnote, and put a couple of pens in it. So it takes a couple, just like that. And it's a lovely little pouch. I don't know where you can get them. They sort of show up and then they disappear. I got it at Chapters here in Canada, a bookstore. But that was very useful, and I'm using that every day as well. So overall, I would say that the pens that I will in future travel with will be these two. If I'm flying, I will take the 456. If I am just traveling, I will take my 308. The 308, when eyedroppered, takes a ton of ink. And so I can't imagine needing more. The only reason you would need more ink, in my view, would be if you want to change colors. So that's why a couple of pens like that, 2 different colors, that would be all I need to take. My Rhodia Webnote and my fake Midori. This would be my travel pack in future. I don't know whether I'll ever use those guys, maybe, but it was a nice trip. I learned a lot about my pens. I learned a lot about traveling with pens. So I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.